Chapter 3, the microcultural context. In this chapter, we're going to be talking predominantly about minority groups, or to use the preferable term, microcultures. You see an example of one of those groups in the picture, Amish women. We're going to be talking about the Amish in the United States as an example of one of those microcultures. But before we get to that topic, I want to just say a few words about the nature of identity. We've used the term cultural identity already in this course to refer to the set of values, beliefs, and behaviors that one acquires from growing up in a particular culture. Social identity refers to the values that one acquires as a result of being a member of a particular group. So, for example, your cultural identity might be defined from the fact that you grow up in a Hispanic household, or that you're Asian American, but your social identity may come as a result of being a student, so you're a member of the university community, or you might be a member of a church congregation, and those groups contribute to the values and beliefs and behaviors that you have. And of course, there's also individual personal identity. So you're different from other people who share your social identity and who share your cultural identity. Cultural identity is what gives you the framework for how to view the world, central to your sense of who you are. Cultural identities are dynamic in the sense that you're not born with those, they're not static, they develop over your lifetime, and they tend to be multifaceted. Particularly in today's world, a lot of people have hybrid cultural identities. When we talk about microcultures, one of the things that comes up is how do those microcultures fit into the mainstream culture in the United States? And there are various metaphors that have been used to describe that process, the oldest of which is the melting pot, which is not a particularly good metaphor because it suggests that one needs to give up one's cultural heritage and blend in with everybody else. The tributaries metaphor kind of has the same problem in the sense that these different streams come together to form the mainstream. There again, you're giving up your unique identity. Tapestry metaphor is somewhat better, but implies that the cultural makeup of the United States is static, and certainly not the case. Garden salad metaphor may be the best in the sense that you have these different ingredients that are distinct and different coming together to enhance the flavor of the salad as a whole. So the individual ingredients maintain their own flavor, but they enhance the blend. There are various terms that we're going to be using in talking about minority groups and majority groups. Dominant culture is one of those. It sometimes implies superiority. Mainstream culture may be a better term to use. Majority culture may not actually refer to the same thing as dominant culture or mainstream culture. In the case of South Africa, for example, for a long time, the dominant culture was defined by white citizens of South Africa, but the majority were not white, but black. So when we're using terms to refer to different cultural groups, we have to show some sensitivity to how those particular groups would like to have themselves be called, and one of the aspects of that is to use the term microculture as preferable to either subculture, certainly pejorative, or even minority group. How do we determine what makes up a microculture? Well, the first thing is that members of this group tend to look and act different from members of the mainstream culture. So they may be different in appearance and dress, in facial characteristics. Behavior may be different as well. Might be even a different language or different dialect used by the microculture. Membership in that group is not something that you choose, but something that you're born into. Members of microcultures practice endogamy. They marry within the group rather than exogamy, marrying outside the group. They tend to be aware of the fact that they're different from the mainstream culture and that they're subordinate to that group. And of course, they're also aware of the fact that they're not treated the same as members of the mainstream culture, that there's some prejudice at work, some discrimination, sometimes even segregation. When we talk about microcultures, one of the theories that's often discussed is the muted group theory. Refers to the fact that the dominant culture, the mainstream culture, often uses a different language or different dialect from the microculture and doesn't value the microculture as a result. And in response, the members of that group often come up with their own language, which may be a dialect, which may be simply changes to the how they use the mainstream language. The microcultures that we're going to be discussing that are mentioned in the text specifically are those that are listed. One shouldn't assume that these are the only important microcultures in the United States. Certainly not. These are just meant to be examples, and they're chosen not only because they're important, but because they represent different kinds of microcultures. If you think of the United States, certainly other groups probably would come to mind. Native Americans, for example, or maybe groups like Asian Americans. Historically, there have been other groups that today are kind of all put together into the category of European Americans that used to be separated out. So there used to be, for example, discrimination against the Irish Americans or Italian Americans. After World War I, there was certainly discrimination against the German Americans as well. And microcultures are not certainly unique to the United States. They're all over the world. And they're often a source of conflict. And so if we think of particular countries in China, in recent years, there have been conflicts with the Tibetans or the Muslim group, the Uyghurs. In fact, in China, there are a number of minority groups. Officially, there are 55 different ethnic groups that are officially recognized in China. In Russia, there are even more minority groups, some 155, in fact. Caucasians, one might think, well, Caucasians, isn't that just white people? And in reference to Russia, what we mean here are the people of the Caucasus mountain range. That's in southern Russia on the border with Georgia. And this has been quite a source of conflict in Russia over the last 10 years or so. In Germany, we've talked already briefly about the Gastarbeiter, the guest workers who came to Germany in the 1950s and 60s from a variety of countries, but above all from Turkey. And it's been the Turks who have been had the most difficulty in finding an appropriate relationship to the dominant culture in Germany. They're very different from mainstream German culture in appearance, dress, language, religion. There are other European countries where there have been significant minority groups, microcultures that have made news in recent years. The Basques in northern Spain in the Pyrenees Mountains on the border with France. Romas are a group that one finds throughout Europe, but there are a large number in Spain. These used to be called the Gypsies. Today, Romas, or in Spain sometimes they're called Gitanos. And there are other European countries as well that one can mention. Pakistanis, for example, in Britain, or the Maghreb immigrants from Algeria or Tunisia in France. The first group in the United States that we're going to be talking about are Hispanics, a large group, in fact, the largest microculture in the United States today, representing 15% of the population, but it's estimated that by the middle of the century they'll represent 25%, a quarter of the U.S. population. Often Hispanics are put together as one group, and they do share particular values, the family, the religion, practices in terms of food consumption. But in fact, Hispanics in the United States come from a large variety of countries. They're certainly the largest number come from Mexico, but there are plenty of immigrants from other Latin American countries as well. One of the interesting aspects of the Hispanic microculture in the United States is the use of language. Obviously, Spanish, very important, different varieties of Spanish. We also have this strange creature called Spanglish. There's, by the way, a Hollywood film by the same name that's kind of interesting. Spanglish is really not a dialect. It's not a Creole. We're going to be talking about Creoles later on. Spanglish is really just an example of what is called in linguistics code switching. That is to say, combining two languages sometimes in the same sentence. And we'll see an example of that in a minute. Chicano English is not a version of Spanish at all. And there again, we'll be looking at an example of that. There's a video that I'm asking you to view in this chapter about Chicano English. There are various stereotypes associated with Hispanics based on the fact that, for example, that in Mexico and other Latin American countries, people traditionally would take a siesta in the afternoon. Sometimes leads to this idea that Hispanics are lazy. There's also machismo, the stereotype that men are insensitive to women, and men from Hispanic cultures. And there are lots of other stereotypes as well. Some of those we saw with the Frito Bandito. We're going to be watching next a short clip by comedian George Lopez.
You could vote English as the official language, but it'll never work. Because we're always going to speak Spanglish. It's too late. That's all we've talked in our house for years. ¿Qué pasó, tía? I went to the store to buy those zapatos that I like, pero estaban gone. Los shoes amarillos, sí, estaban todos sold out. And I even hided them too. Do you remember hiding shit you couldn't afford to buy that day? You take this shoe, I'm gonna put them over here, mira. I'll make a mark right there so they know. Then you come back Saturday when you got money, watcha? Hey. We'll always speak English and Spanish. My grandpa used to yell at me in Spanish, and I would yell at him back in English. Tira la basura, cabrón! I am! For God's sakes, déjame in paz. Cripes. Hijo de la chingada. You heard me, higo. HDLJ. Higo de la chingada. And let me tell you this, success even surprises Latinos. You know, like I was in a hotel and I'm staying in the presidential suite. Mira, muy chingón, the presidential suite. Thank you for being proud. So they knock on the door, the lady, housekeeping. I open the door, he's already cleaned the room.
This clip is interesting for a couple of different reasons. First of all, if you're not familiar with George Lopez, he's an entertainer who was born not in Mexico but in California and raised in a Mexican-American family. And it's interesting what he says about language. He says it's too late for English as the official language. Hispanics have already created their own, namely Spanglish. And he gives, he shows some examples there of that code switching we were talking about, going back and forth between English and Spanish, sometimes in the same sentence, sometimes he using English and another member of his family using Spanish. This kind of thing is very common in bilingual families. One of the other interesting aspects of this clip is some of the behaviors that he talks about as part of his comedy routine are ones that can be viewed as stereotypes of Hispanics. For example, he talks about not having enough money to buy shoes, so you go into the department store, the shoe store, and actually hide the pair that you want, come back when you have money, kind of pointing to that stereotype of poverty of Hispanics. Talks about how he gets a presidential suite in a hotel, and when the Hispanic housekeeper comes and sees him, another Hispanic says, "Oh, the room's already been cleaned," and taking George Lopez, namely, for the housekeeper because it is Hispanic. But one of the aspects of this, of using stereotypes, is who is it that's using the stereotypes? In this case, it's a member of that community, part of the in-group. And who is his audience? Well, you can tell by the laughter when he speaks English that the people in the audience are largely Hispanics, that they understand the jokes that are in Spanish. So it's a different proposition when somebody from the in-group uses those stereotypes or uses labels that may be derogatory, versus somebody from outside doing the same thing. Okay, we're going to stop the presentation at this point and continue with Chapter 3 in the next presentation.